Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of Friday Morning at the Fun House, alongside my good friend, Mr. Martin Popoff from
Morning.
Canada.
Yeah,
What's up,
you
Martin?
bet. Bright and cheery Canada.
That's right. I don't think I need to
Actually,
say
more
that
more
anymore.
like
I think
gray
after
and
all this time,
overcast.
people know you're from Canada. I don't think I even need to say that anymore. But is the sun shining by you with no clouds in the sky?
Yeah, no, we got a lot of clouds in the sky.
Uh,
Winter's threatening again. So
Yeah, I heard rumblings we might get some snow this weekend, but I mean, yesterday it was like in the mid 50s during the day, and then at night it dipped down to like in the 20s. I mean, by the time like 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon came around, I went to take the dogs outside, and I was like, "Holy cow! It's like 20 degrees colder than it was just a little while ago." And I was like, "Oh,
yeah,
but that's the way it's been, up and down, up and down, up and down." So
I think World Cup fires up again today. I think
that's right for
this
all those
round.
soccer fans, yeah, or
Yeah,
football fans, as many of them like to call it. Yeah, I don't follow it at all, but I know that's all people have been talking about for the last month.
yeah,
It's like
yeah.
whatever. That's cool that people are into it. I've been embroiled in the baseball winter meetings all week, as I'm sure you have as well.
Ah,
And your team didn't make many moves, Martin.
yeah, that's true. That's true. My wife's kind of excited about what the Jays are going to do this year. I don't know. I mean, every year just seems to be baseball is just such a weird long slog, right?
It
Get to
is.
the end of these 150 games or whatever, and it's like, oh, you're 6 games above 500. Congratulations.
I
You
know.
know?
It's yeah. I've been watching baseball my whole life, and in some ways I'm a traditionalist, but man, it is a long season. Does it need to be 162 games? Because as we saw this year, not to deviate from our topic here and talk baseball for 45 minutes, but you have a team that I'll use the Mets as an example, right? First place team throughout the whole year, and the last like 2 weeks they go into a
Oh
little
yeah,
tailspin, knocked out of first place, and they get bumped
awful.
in the first round of the playoffs. And the
Yeah,
Phillies, who played kind of like mediocre baseball all year long, get hot at the end of the year, make it all the way to the World Series. They don't win, but that's the way it goes. And it's almost like the great teams that do so well throughout the whole season, it almost like it means nothing by the time October rolls around. And I
yeah,
don't know how fair that is because you want the best teams playing each other in the end, right?
yeah,
Not like a mediocre team that just squeaks in, all of a sudden wins it all because they get hot the last 3 weeks of the season. I don't
yeah,
know, kind of strange.
yeah.
But
No,
my Mets did really well this week. They picked up lots of pieces, and I think more's coming. So we'll see how it goes.
yeah,
Anyway, on to the topic at hand. So last week, Martin and I, as we generally do every week after we get done taping an episode, we have a little production meeting where we talk about what's coming for next week. And we started talking about this whole idea of like subgenre tags or names and how there's so many of them. And we were talking about something else, and we started talking about, yeah, and this kind of music is called this, and this is called this, and that's not much different than this. And there's so many. So we decided let's take a stab at having a full episode about subgenre names and how stupid so many of them are. And as a preface for that, you have to do a little research and some of the bands that fit into these categories and why they fit into these categories. So part of this will be kind of like a history of and an explanation of what these subgenres are based on what we've seen in history and what people have named them and the bands that are lumped into them, but also why we think that the names are kind of dumb in the end. But so we've each got five. We've assigned each other five. We've got some props to show. We've got some stuff to talk about. So I'll have Martin kick us off with our first subgenre that is stupid of the day.
yeah. Exactly. So yeah, just a little background. I mean, I went on a buddies of mine's show, Joe Becht. He's got this new show called Average Joe's. He's a contrarian Patreon, and he listens to my podcast and all this. And we had a great show on just his proposal was are these subgenre things a good idea, and why do we use them, sort of thing. So I approached Pete and said, well, let's do something a little different, and let's just complain about subgenres, right? Let's just find some to complain about, and we each have five, and my first one is hair metal. So I've got a few props here. So, we all know, Pete and I know that there's this one guy that comments all the time. We don't know who he is, but every time we say hair metal, he gets into the YouTube comments and starts complaining about the term hair metal. And I think he's the same guy, if I'm not mistaken, that has tried to propose a new name for this and call it like big music or something like this. Like, he just seems, or somebody there seems so desperate to get rid of this tag because it's seen as derogatory. I think it's a good cheeky name that essentially describes. We all know what is meant by it. There's not really much of a problem with it. So this is a stupid one that riles people who love that genre. but I think it works, and everybody knows what it is. So you know, I love the genre, but I'm fine with the name because what's wrong with poking a little fun? It's only rock and roll, but we like it, right? You know, it starts in '83 kind of thing. You know, I've got some problem things here where you say, okay, do these things belong in hair metal? We've got a New York band, and this is 1982. This is apparently before it all starts, right? So is that supposed to be hair metal? You know, I've often proposed the term dirty hair metal, which applies to your Skid Rows and Love Hates and maybe Badlands and the bluesy metal sort of thing. You've got your psychedelic hair metal of later on. You've got old folks doing hair metal. I mean, is this supposed to be, this, you know, it's more the ultimate sin, but are you allowed to like jump in and be hair metal and still be called hair metal? Who knows? And then, you know, I thought of a band like this. And this speaks to our buddies, you know, this idea of don't call it hair metal, right? Is Mr. Big too classy to be called hair metal, right? And you know, when okay, so this is early on. This is what we call late hair metal, where I always figure like these bands are all trying harder because of grunge sort of thing. But later on, I mean, number one, should they have been part of that to begin with? They were a little glammy looking in the beginning, I suppose. But you know, at what point do you even stop having hair metal? Is it 1991 when Nirvana arrives? Is it 1992 and 1993 where everybody fulfills the last records of their deals and then they get pushed off over to Cheese Metal Cemetery, CMC? Remember that whole thing, right? You know, and when these bands try grunge or when they stick with it and they keep doing it. I thought I had one more. Yeah, so another old timers one. You know, is this a hair metal band doing grunge? Is it a 70s band? Is it a hard rock band doing grunge? I mean, they were certainly one of the big, you know, participants in the whole hair metal thing, right? So it's a stupid genre name. It's fun, it's cheeky, everybody knows what it is. But you know, I have no problem with it. I think it describes what's going on. I guess the last thing I'll say is sometimes these hair metal guys say, well, the thrash guys had pretty nice hair too, you know, and all this stuff. Everybody's got hair. The only thing that's not hair metal is bald metal, right? so yeah, I'm fine with it. But that's my first one, hair metal.
I mean, we could have done a whole show on this. Really. And spoiler alert, we are going to do a couple of hair metal shows in the not too distant future. We've already got them in the planning stages. So just for those who have been wondering and waiting, that's coming. You know, this brings up lots of comments here from me. Pantera. So isn't it interesting how most people got to know Pantera with obviously Cowboys from Hell and Onward, right? Which is the anti-hair metal. But yet the people who kind of discovered their earlier music afterwards automatically called them the hair metal albums, which when you really listen to those early Pantera albums, they're not really hair metal like we kind of think of hair metal. It's just not Pantera's normal style of music that we've come to know and love. Yeah. So it's just amazing how, looking back now, a lot of music that's not quite thrash or traditional metal was just thrown into that category. I mean, Mr. Big is a perfect example. They were from that period. I never, you know, them, Tesla, God, there's so many other bands you could think of, like Badlands and Blue Murder and all these bands, all right? Because they came out right around that same time and they weren't quite thrash or early extreme metal or even traditional metal, let's just throw them over here because we don't really know where to put them. Mr. Big is a perfect example. Extreme is another one. Mr. Big is a perfect example because their music is kind of bluesy, right? So all of a sudden there's this blues rock element. Spoiler alert, that's coming up in this show as well that I will be talking about. And how does that fit? Tesla, always much more of a blues-based hard rock band, but yet a lot of people, oh, Tesla, hair metal, right? Because they came out in 1985 to 1989, right? That's when they debuted. So sometimes I think that certain bands, when they debuted on the scene, and if they weren't really heavy, they're a hair metal band. And if they had long hair, which, as you said, they all did, right? So what's the difference? Yeah. And is there a better term? For me, I never minded the hair metal term because it's, again, we didn't create it. it's kind of stuck for all these years. We're going on almost 40 years now. And it was a look, right? It was a look and an attitude, and nothing more than that. I never thought it as derogatory. And my personal opinions on, the bands that I like and don't like from this scene notwithstanding, it's something that stuck. And whatever. We talked about thrash last week, and was thrash a perfect term for that kind of music? Maybe not. We have other ideas that probably makes more sense, but I don't have an issue with glam metal. I mean, glam metal.
I'll just say one last thing about this. I mean, Pantera was partially because of the pictures, but when you think about it, that's the space between thrash and hair metal, is this thing that I used to joke and call poverty metal, right? Like you think of like all those metal blade bands from 84 and 85. That Pantera look is that early version of American power metal, that meat and potatoes American power metal look, right?
Lee's Lord and early Fate Warning,
which has got a foot in the thrash look, and it's got a foot in the hair metal look.
Yeah. Good point. All right, so let's move on to something that has been called melodic death metal. Some people watching are going to be, who don't like extreme metal, going to be like, how can death metal be melodic with those Cookie Monster vocals and whatnot? Well, I'm here to explain it for you. So also sometimes called mellow death, right? So this is a style of music that basically got its. This is a style of music that's has its roots in Gothenburg, Sweden. Okay, it's often called the Gothenburg sound. That kind of came about basically with this album, At the Gates, Slaughter of the Soul. All right. So we're looking at here some of the characteristics of melodic death metal. Melodic guitar solos. Gee, what a surprise. And lots of solos. Twin guitars and twin guitar harmonies. Oftentimes brutal vocals, but not the lower register guttural death metal growl that we associate with like the Florida death metal scene, right? Traditional death metal. Sometimes vocals that are kind of shouted or higher pitched screams. Right. So a little bit of variety in the style of singing, but the music and the song structures much more rooted in traditional heavy metal and thrash, with a big influence coming from the new wave of British heavy metal. And vis-a-vis that, Thin Lizzy, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden. Okay. Occasionally utilizing clean vocals. And again, going back to the Gothenburg scene. So we got At the Gates, you got bands like Dark Tranquillity, In Flames, Soilwork, later on, bands like Arch Enemy, right? So much later on. You got albums like, like I mentioned, Slaughter of the Soul, The Gallery, Heartwork, Carcass, another band. Okay. Jester Race by In Flames. And then this kind of spurred on a kind of second wave where you have bands from all over the planet who are taking part of this. So you got, Darkhain and Arsis, Devil Driver, Amon Amarth, Hypocrisy, Cataclysm, Children of Bodom, right? American bands, Finnish bands, British bands, right? And then this whole thing becomes even further complicated when you've got these bands, again, another weird tag called metalcore. Bands, and a lot of this was happening here in the US. You got these bands who were originally hardcore bands, but they really like some of these sounds coming from the Swedish band. So they're going to add this metal element to their hardcore sound. And now all of a sudden you've got the Swedish bands who are liking what the American bands are doing. And all of a sudden, it's indistinguishable between all these bands, whether they're called melodic death metal or metalcore or traditional whatever. Then you got Killswitch Engage, All That Remains, As I Lay Dying, blah, 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 blah. And to the point nowadays, there's almost no difference at all in the sound. So it definitely is a style. But if you talk to like death metal purists, here's the catch here. If you talk to death metal purists, they think that a lot of this music is kind of garbage, especially the stuff that's come out in the last 20 years, and it's not death metal at all. Because there are characteristics of this that I just spoke about, and there are characteristics of traditional death metal. And when you really listen to them side by side, other than the extreme vocals, and they're not even the same, there's really not a lot of things that are similar here. Because if you go listen to like a Suffocation album or a Cannibal Corpse album or a Deicide album or 6 Feet Under or Morbid Angel or whatever, and you listen to like a Dark Tranquillity album, it's not really the same. So, is it really melodic in the end? If you're talking to someone who is not into extreme metal at all, and you say melodic and death metal and together in the same term, they're going to be like, I don't hear anything melodic about this. For the true passionate death metal fans, this kind of stuff is too melodic. Needs to be more extreme. Needs to be more underground sounding. So is it really death metal? Is it really melodic? I don't know. Does it have a definable sound and style? I absolutely think it does. But the whole melodic death metal term to me was always absolutely ridiculous because, again, I don't know if it's necessarily death metal. And even like the lyrical content is very, very different. So I'll kind of stop there, Martin. I don't know if you have a couple comments on this.
Yeah, that's absolutely perfect. I really have nothing to add because at the end you said what I was going to sort of summarize, and the stupidity of this term is it's not particularly melodic and it's not particularly death metal. It's not even original Swedish death metal sounding. So if there were two death metals before, it's neither of them. Right. So it's not that either. And the last thing I'll say is that I hate writing a record review and having to use that word melodic, and I hate having to use that word mellow. Right. So yeah, and then
there's nothing mellow about it, right? There's nothing mellow about it.
Yeah, forget it. Okay, that's it. That was perfect. That was absolutely perfect on that. So okay, so my next one is let's go with this one. So alternative, hard alternative, indie rock, garage rock. There was this time in the 90s when Tim Anderson and I were getting this magazine going, Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles, and it was a war on heavy metal at the time, right? And Tim ran this flagship massive heavy metal department in the HMV flagship store, right at the busiest intersection of all of Canada, Yonge and Dundas, like right there, Canada's poor man's version of Times Square, right? And he had this huge metal section. It was selling tons of stuff all the time. He was an enthusiastic runner of this section and stuff. And I remember him grousing at times that, they wanted me to use these new hard alternative tags and stick this in here and all this. And it was just a funny thing that there was this alternative thing going on. So, eventually I just grabbed some props of just random. I have so much of this stuff on CD, but your Collective Souls were kind of hardish alternative. Your Therapy, were they grunge because they were from overseas, right? Could they be called that? Smashing Pumpkins, no one knew if this, you're from Chicago, are you a grunge band, or are you a hard alternative band? Everclear, is it clear that they're a alternative band, or is it Evergray? Is there a gray area that they're a hard alternative band? So I just noticed these sitting next to each other in my rack, so I thought I'd bring this out, which is, this is a little bit of melodic death metal,
right? Another old Gothenburg band, right?
Yeah, and now we're like too melodic, so we can't be called melodic death metal.
Too melodic, too progressive,
and we're too progressive. So are we progressive death metal? Are we melodic? Yeah. So it's definitely not alternative. But yeah, I always thought that was kind of funny. And there's the built-in stupidity of when you're alternative and you start going double and triple platinum, are you the alternative anymore? Are you now the alternative to the alternative? Are you the mainstream alternative to the alternative, right? And then hard alternative was this designed thing by the industry to take things out of the heavy metal tag, which wasn't selling and was the kiss of death. So you'd now call some of that stuff hard alternative, and you'd have these bands dress a little differently, and it would be like 30 to 40% grunge in what they were doing to be called hard alternative. And then you had indie rock, which was the same sort of thing. Were you indie now that you were signed to a label? And what makes you, I mean, are you indie if you're on a small label, or do you have to be truly independent and put your stuff out? And then are you still indie when you sound weird, but now Warner Brothers signs you, right? And then garage rock is kind of the same thing. It's like, well, who wants to sound like an old rudimentary caveman 60s sound, right? So are you garage rock anymore when you start recording a little better? Or are you just garage rock because you only use 3 chords, right? Yeah. And your hi-hat's a little open, right? So all of these ones have this undermining aspect to them. It's like, we're calling ourselves cool because we're small, so we're alternative or hard alternative or indie or garage kind of thing. So I think all of them kind of go together, and all of them were this annoying thing that happened in the mid-90s kind of thing.
And none of them really mean anything. Like,
Yeah.
what is alternative? Like,
Yeah.
an alternate to what?
Yeah.
I think, you know, in my mind, again, this is just me trying to rationalize it 30 years ago, alternative music was something that was not something else that was popular at the time. And what was popular at the time was, back it up, hair metal and thrash and all that kind of stuff. So alternative music was kind of like the anti that, and they called it alternative. But yet you had all these bands that were labeled as alternative, and so many of them didn't even sound alike. There was no, like, to me, specific sound or style. It was just not that. Right. So like we walked from the 80s into the 90s, and everything that wasn't hair metal, thrash, and traditional metal was now labeled as alternative. But what was it? And then the whole indie thing came along, and it's like, well, originally indie was supposed to be, you know, small productions, DIY productions, bands that weren't signed. And so it was like an indie movement because more bands were wanting to do that. But then all of a sudden it's like, oh, they sound like an indie band. Well, what the fuck does an indie band sound like? I don't know. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Like
And it's funny, garage rock. Yeah, and garage rock in the 60s was the alternative to major label. And then you had that term underground music, which is an alternative. You know, it literally has it kind of in the title. We're underground.
Yeah.
You know, where they're skulking around in the sewer system, making this weird hard progressive music, right? Underground music. And then later on, you know, post-punk to punk is the alternative. It doesn't really have it built into the name, but it was music that reminded you vaguely of what alternative music was supposed to be, which is weird, right?
Yeah. I don't know. You know, and then you get a band like Soundgarden or Alice in Chains come to mind. And at the time, you know, they were labeled as grunge or alternative. But meanwhile, I've always thought of Alice in Chains and Soundgarden as basically just a continuation of the early metal and whatnot from the 70s and the 80s. It's just wasn't all that much different, but yet it was called something else. It's bizarre. Bizarre. Equally as bizarre, my next choice, something called Neoprog or neo-progressive rock.
Right.
If you look at the term, you know, neo and what that means, it means new or revived, right? So, and in theory, neo-progressive rock or neo-prog kind of came to prominence in the UK, specifically in the early 80s, and then, you know, full-blown blossomed in the 90s. But basically, it was a style of progressive rock that kind of was a continuation of 70s classic symphonic progressive rock, most commonly thought of as the style of Genesis. Okay, so you had bands like Marillion, right? Specifically their early albums with Fish on vocals, IQ, right, with an album like The Wake, Palace from Scotland, Pendragon from the UK. 12th Night were another band that kind of came on the scene in the early 80s, and again took that like Genesis style of these somewhat Peter Gabrielish vocals, lots of keyboards, lots of drama, melancholiness, less maybe complex compared to bands like Gentle Giant or Yes or Emerson, Lake and Palmer, not as bombastic, more song based. And then in the 90s, you had this whole other movement, bands like Arena, bands like Jadis and Galahad and Collage and Magenta, and then eventually bands like Frost. And people wanted to call this something. And this neo-prog tag just came in. It's like all of a sudden you were either as far as the fans and the journalists go, you were either a classic symphonic progressive rock band, or if you had that kind of somewhat Genesis-y sound, you became Neoprog. All right. And but this music became known for being a little more accessible version of the 70s sound. Lots of keyboards and synthesizers, shorter songs, less complex, certainly symphonic, but kind of tame. And you had labels like Giant Electric P and Griffin Music, who were just pumping out all these bands from the UK, left and right, who were being labeled as Neoprog. And I remember, as someone who was heavily into prog, really got into prog in the early 90s, to me, there was a big distinction from listening to a band like from the Scandinavian bands like Anglagard and Anecdote, or even the US bands like Spock's Beard and whatnot. And then you would hear some of these British bands that were coming out with these kind of safe sounding, but, you know, again, remind you of early Genesis, and like, oh, that's kind of neat. But now, all these years later, it's kind of looked at as like a bad thing. Right. Oh, if you're called Neoprog at any point in time, it means you're kind of safer, more poppy version of, or a watered down example of something that a lot of us loved from the old days, from the 70s. And I'll tell a quick little story here. I'm not going to mention who he was, but there is a very prominent guitar player from the UK who has been in a handful of these bands that are kind of labeled as Neoprog. And Stephen Reed, one of our writers and obviously co-host of the UK Connection and in the prog scene, he had reviewed one of the albums from this guitar player not that long ago, and threw the whole Neoprog tag in the review. And he actually heard from this guitar player complaining about the fact that he used that, because he goes, that's the worst thing that you could kind of say in a review of my album, because I don't like, I and the band, we don't like to be called that at all. And it's now from the bands that kind of toiled in this style, they do not want to be called that. They do not like this terminology. And again, exactly what is neo? It's like, again, I'll reiterate, new or revived. So is it really new? Okay, it really isn't, other than the fact it's recent in the last 30 years. But this whole Neoprog thing is basically just, and maybe, you know, is it a revival of an old classic sound? Sure it is. Maybe a little watered down, certainly much more melodic and pop based and more accessible to the masses. Sure, I would agree. Is it necessarily a bad thing? I don't know. There's bands from all over the world who have kind of done this kind of more pop-based classic progressive rock sound, but it just call it prog, because that's what it is, right? Why does it, just because it's like it came 10-20 years after the golden years of progressive rock, that we have to call it something else, when in summary, is it all that much different than what the classic sound was? Can it just be called progressive rock? Why does it have to be called neo-progressive rock? I don't know. Silly terminology, but well, it kind of stuck.
Yeah, and again, the stupidity of this one is glaring, because almost a better title would have been retro prog, right? So you've got prog over here, you've got retro prog over here, yet they call it neo prog way over here. And it's like the bands that were actually doing neo prog were King Crimson, Genesis, Yes. I mean, they were making a new kind of prog. Peter Gabriel, Kate Bush. So expanding
on their original sound, for sure.
Well, it's moving on from the original sound in a big way. It was like being neo. It was being way more neo. So these guys that were doing the neo prog were actually doing the retro prog.
Right.
So it's a little bit like it's a little, or the motivation is a little bit like the hardcore guys moving on from punk. When punk becomes post-punk and gets really arty, these guys say, where'd the heaviness go, right? So let's invent hardcore, right? So you could have called this hardcore prog, because they're hardcore. They're all doing Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, right? Meanwhile, there's nothing more neo than King Crimson, Discipline, Beat, and Three of a Perfect Pair, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and if a lot of people harp on the fact that it's like classic prog light, and there's all these pop elements, well, then just call it progressive pop if you want to do that, right? Because it's definitely, there's a lot of pop elements, and it's definitely kind of proggy, right? I don't know. It's just call it prog. It's all prog. Who cares, right?
Yeah. I don't know. All right. So my next stupid one is let's go with let's move that over there. Let's go with glam. So glam is a problem for a couple of reasons, because as old music fans die and are buried, people forget that the term originally applied to, a certain kind of spaceman look and sound and glitter. The other term for it was glitter rock. That ran from roughly 1971 to 1974. That was glam, right? But hair metal usurped the word glam, so that glam is like the second most popular term for hair metal. And then the problem with glam as well, besides applying to two different things, very different things that have nothing in common other than some makeup, essentially, and maybe a bit of the clothes and the color and the flash. But the other problem is there's no glam sound. It's like, is Queen glam? Is Roxy Music glam? Here's kind of the originals. David Bowie fits definitely in the glam thing, with the whole Ziggy Stardust thing, but the music is just kind of everywhere. It's singer-songwritery. It's a little old rock and roll. There was a little bit of a 50s rock and roll revival that's coursing through the early 70s as well. That's actually part of the glam sound in some ways. We have our favorite heavy metal version of glam in Sweet. You've got Slade. And then the funny thing is, I love this. We should do a show on this genre at some point. I may not be the expert for it. You may have other guys that you talk to who are more of an expert, but the whole polite late period glam thing, right? The whole Pilot, Smoky, Silver. I don't even know all these bands. I don't like any of them, but that whole, when the glam guys started dressing like old style Dennis DeYoung and Styx, right? When they started, putting on the leisure suits and the suits and cleaning up a little bit, right? Yep. Sweet kind of did the same thing. They moved in that direction, as well as even a leather and studs direction in some of the pictures, right? But there is this 75 to 77 period of they're not looking particularly glam there, right? It's more like I say, polite glam, yacht. It's like British yacht rock, in a way, right? Is kind of what it is. But people were still wanting to hang on to that glam tag, certainly in 75. Hello, bands like that, right? As you move 75 to 76. So that was a problem. And then, of course, we have our main glam band from the hair metal genre, Poison, and Cinderella with the real sort of glamorous look. And then, of course, you had the whole firecracker fizzle of really calling Iggy Pop, Alice Cooper, or Lou Reed glam in any way, or even the New York Dolls. That whole UK thing didn't apply to them. It was missing the humor. It was more dark and menacing, where in the UK it was camp, right? This whole thing with campness about homosexuality on TV, in the TV shows, and even the campness of something like Benny Hill, right? That whole thing, sure. Right? Monty Python. So there was a humor slightly applied to it. Like, we're kind of making fun of ourselves a little bit. And you look at some of those old pictures of Slade and Sweet and stuff, and they're just the most embarrassing looking, rock and roll photos, live shots, Top of the Pops, Old Grey Whistle Test, whatever, that you've ever seen, right? So yeah, definitely a stupid one for those two reasons. There's no singular type of music it applies to. It's more of a fashion thing. And then it's kind of applied to two totally different things.
Yeah, you're 100% correct. I'm thinking like some other bands too, like T-Rex and Martha Hoople. Yeah. There's no similarities in the music at all, other than, maybe from the British aspect, there's a lightheartedness and a fun aspect of the music. But other than that, there's no stylistic similarities really. And yeah, I think it all had to do with the fashion sense. That's got to be it. Yeah. All right. Let's move on to something, and I'm going to kind of you're going to get a 2-for-1 on this one, because they're very closely tied, but yet to a lot of people they're very, very different. Progressive death metal and technical death metal, or progressive technical death metal, right? Or tech death, or prog death, whatever.
Math rock.
Yeah, math rock, right? Yeah, absolutely, yes. So I'm glad you brought that up. Arguably started in the early 90s with the American band Death and the Human album, right? They had a couple albums before this that were more traditional death metal, but here all of a sudden you have Chuck Schuldiner and company who are incorporating much more intricate song structures, guitar solos that drew from prog and jazz, and all of a sudden this becomes much more mature music. much more technical and much more progressive, right? And you had other bands in their immediate wake, like Cynic with Focus, right? You had a couple of Atheist albums, right? Pestilence, Morbid Angel, Suffocation, Cannibal Corpse, and then Meshuggah a couple of years later, who all of a sudden creating this form of death metal that's just instead of straightforward with just traditional riffs and the guttural vocals. Now, Cynic is using vocoder on the vocals, kind of adding the space rock type of thing to it. These very, very intricate guitar and drum lines and patterns and jazz fusion bass lines. And all of a sudden, you've got this thing called progressive death metal, right? It's still ferocious, still have the guttural growls in there, but now musically speaking, much, much different beast. Totally, totally different. And then, eventually, and so again, is that progressive? Is it technical? Is it both? At that point in time, it didn't really matter. It's just death metal, but it's more progressive. Then you got a band coming along from Sweden called Opeth, right? Blackwater Park. And now what they're bringing into play are folk elements. So you have all these acoustic instrumentation being added into the mix. You've got clean melodic vocals to go along with the death metal growls. You've got mellotron and Hammond organ synthesizers and keyboards and things like that. So all of a sudden now it's like it's 70s prog and folk mixed with death metal. It's kind of technical, right? Then you get a band from Germany called Obscura who come in, and now the technicality is ratcheted up a million times. And it's still progressive, but now it's so highly technical that, well, it's not really proggy. There's no folk elements here. There's no atmospheric moments. It's just nonstop machine-like precision, very, very intricate and complex. It's technical. You got bands like Spawn of Possession, Brain Drill, Nile, Gorguts, Decapitated, The Faceless, Necrophagius, all these other bands that are doing this highly technical thing. And now this tech death has been created. All right. But is it not still progressive because it's so intricately layered? It is, but yet you'll get people that'll argue to death that there's a wide gulf between something like this and something like this, and certainly something like this. All right. And they'll say that something like this is not really influenced by the 70s, whereas this is highly influenced by the 70s. I don't know. To me, it's all death metal. It's all kind of progressive. Again, we think of classical terms in progressive. Yes, Genesis, King Crimson, all that. I think there are elements of that in all this music, but yet it still owes a lot to the early death metal pioneers, again, like Morbid Angel, Death, Possessed, whatever other bands you want to kind of bring to play here. It's all death metal to me, but it's just much more not straightforward. It's progressive, it's technical. Do we need both tags? I don't know. It's just ridiculous. The whole tech death thing, because to me, progressive death metal was always technical. But now I guess if you take out the folk and the progginess, it's tech death. I don't know. I get confused. I'm confused now. I'm talking about it. All I know is I really like all this stuff. Yeah, so whatever the hell you want to call it, I don't know.
Yeah, to put one other little brushstroke on the canvas, I remember the whole late 90s thing with, we used to call it relapse core, right? The whole Dillinger Escape Plan craze, right? I remember Tim and I being at that metal fest in New Jersey and just watching. I'm pretty sure it was Dillinger Escape Plan, and just looking at each other going, how can those guys like leap around and jump around and even remember any of this stuff, let alone play it, right? That's the thing you think about with some of these prog situations, right? But and like, talk about being progressive. I mean, it was incredibly progressive, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's that whole mathcore, relapse core we used to joke about, because relapse really specialized in that really complicated is it death? Is it coming from a punk rock thing, a hardcore thing? It's, again, you think of it's what you're talking about with the hi-hat a little more open, right?
Yeah, and that style of music, this whole mathcore thing, is really interesting, because you throw a different wrinkle in here. So then those bands were listening to guys like Dream Theater. So all of a sudden you have these bands who are listening to Dream Theater, they're listening to the classic hardcore stuff, they were listening to all this classic death metal and the prog death metal, and they're doing something completely different. Dillinger Escape Plan, Between the Buried and Me. I mean, there's tons of other bands that all of a sudden created this new style of progressive metal that is very intricate and mathy. I always thought the math metal or math rock or whatever was really bizarre as well. But vocally, they're coming from more of a hardcore place, right, as opposed to traditional metal or even death metal. So again, that adds another wrinkle. And a lot of those bands, they use keyboards and things, so just and horns and whatnot. So it's just like, what is that? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
All right. Cool. So I'm going to go back to your theme about Neo, and talk a little bit about the new wave of British heavy metal. So why is this a stupid genre tag? It's got a few reasons. So it's got the obvious, when is new no longer new again. It also has the one, every time you bring this up, there's that guy that comes out and says it was not a genre, it was a movement, right? So there's that thing that goes along with it. It's definitely a huge mouthful, new wave of British heavy metal. And it comes from an editorial subline in an article about a live display of these things. It's a bit of a long story. There's a Sounds magazine with Ted Nugent on the cover, and there's a big article in there where it's written in there, the new wave of British heavy metal. So yeah, it's a mouthful, and then do you spell it out? Do you just use the initials? And then it's also stupid because the odd person will say New Wabam, and then he gets nailed, hammered down and punched out. It's like, don't say New Wabam. That's ridiculous. That just shows you're a newbie or something, or a newbie who's an oldie, right? So here we are, back to the new again, and then combined with that. So yeah, I just wanted to. It's got other problems like, does Motorhead belong? Is the sound right? So there's, we talked about the Bike Wheel and bands that are off it. Are you allowed to be old people and be new wave of British heavy metal? Or are you allowed to be Swedish and be called new wave of Swedish heavy metal? We've got the new wave of American heavy metal now. There's another classic Swedish one, my two Torch albums. And then it ties in a little bit with the same complaint about new metal. NU-metal, right? Is Creed new metal, or are they grunge? Is Papa Roach new metal? Is Disturbed new metal? Is Rage Against the Machine new metal? So, and when does that stop being new anymore? And then what people really complained about the new metal thing is that it bothered a lot of people that there was zero descriptiveness in that term. It was, except for it being a new kind of metal. So I guess there is some logic to it. I mean, it was an evolution. Starts with Korn, right? The Ross Robinson sound, a little bit of Sepultura into Korn, and then that sort of defined one way of doing it. 7-string basses and emo vocals and lyrics and all this. There's a million things, right? Hip hop brought into it, et cetera, et cetera. And then everybody sort of complained, well, what's this NU thing? Who's being cheeky and smart alecky coming up with this, right? With the dash. And then sometimes there'd be a little umlaut over the U's, right?
Yes.
So that happened as well. So yeah, that's it. That's your new problem. But so new wave of British heavy metal's got the new problem, the super big mouthful thing. Is it a genre? Is it a movement? And New Wabam.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as we kind of talked about on the New Wave of British Heavy Metal show a couple of weeks ago, there are so many differences in style and sound during the time of the New Wave of British Heavy Metal that it's hard to kind of pinpoint exactly, who the poster child is for that, for the people who argue against it being a sound. Yeah, to an extent, right? But you can't argue that there was a lot of bands that came up around that time, and there was a look and a style and an attitude. As far as like new metal is concerned, at the time, I remember when people were calling bands that, metal was kind of dead, especially here in North America. Metal was kind of dead, and it kind of went back into the underground for a while throughout much of the 90s. So when bands like Korn and the like started popping up in the latter part of the 90s into the early 2000s, basically these were just heavy bands that were incorporating a lot of the things that were becoming popular in the 90s. So you had, like, again, you mentioned hip hop and you mentioned alternative and all that. And it was just kind of taking those elements from those genres and putting it back into heavy metal and creating something a little bit different. And, these bands, they stuck out like a sore thumb. They didn't sound like the 80s bands or the 70s bands. They were doing something completely new. But in hindsight, a lot of people who were into metal back, or heavy music back in the 70s and 80s, you look back on the new metal scene now, and it's, to me anyway, I'm like, a lot of those bands, to me, not bands that I really hold in a lot of favor. but maybe that's just me, I don't
know. Two more props that I forgot here. So Mudvayne, so
yeah.
they're new metal, but a little math rocky as well.
Yep.
And then Coal Chamber, which brings up a genre called spooky core.
That's right.
Remember spooky core, right? So that whole goth mixed with new metal thing, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And I didn't even talk about before deathcore, right? So that's another extension of like the whole technical and progressive death metal, even an extension of metalcore and of melodic death metal. It's like,
remember Blackened Death?
Oh, yes.
Pretty good. That's actually a good one, actually. I like that one because it's a great descriptor, right? It literally was this cool mix between death metal and black metal, right?
Yeah. And people are probably watching right now. Well, what is black metal then? All right. So black metal, just another kind of extreme metal where you have, which borrows a lot from thrash, borrows a lot from the spookiness of gothic hard rock and metal from the 70s and the early 80s. Played really fast, lots of atmosphere, tremolo picked riffs, hellish, high-pitched, screamy vocals, right?
You drink red wine with black metal and you drink vodka with Blackened Death, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So all right. Moving on. How about the term blues rock? I don't know. Last I checked, Martin, rock and roll came from the blues, right? So fuck is the difference here? Blues rock. So rock music that has a heavy blues element, and again probably got its start with the British blues bands from the 60s who were moving into the 70s and all of a sudden started to add more basic rock elements into their music. And I think for me the first band that kind of came to mind was Fleetwood Mac. Like the early albums are very much just straight British blues. And then all of a sudden, then played on. You got a lot more rock elements going here. Cream, I guess, is another good example. The early Chicken Shack stuff, right? All of a sudden starting to move away from the straight blues into more rock stuff. Savoy Brown, Kim Simmons and Savoy Brown's another perfect example here. Certainly those early Led Zeppelin albums, right, are very bluesy, but kind of heavy. Then you got Free coming along right around the same time. Again, it's bluesy, but it's definitely rock music. In the States, you've got, well, it started off in England, but, Jimi Hendrix and The Experience, right, very bluesy music, but still clearly rock. Cactus. You got, all of a sudden these guitar guys coming out of the woodwork that are using psychedelia in the blues, mixing with rock. You got Robin Trower. I don't know if I should show the Cactus album there. You got Pat Travers, Frank Marino. Then you have more like mainstreamy sounding bands that still utilize the blues quite a bit, like Bad Company.
Well, we got a lot of CDs to put away after this.
Oh yeah, that's why. Originally, I wasn't going to pull a lot, and then I was like, "Holy crap! I'm going to be spending a half hour putting all this shit away." The interesting thing about this is that for the blues purists, all of this stuff rocks way too much, and that's the thing. And I think for some of the people who want just good rock and roll, why is it so damn bluesy, right? Why do we have to have these slow songs? Why do we have to have all these lyrics about longing and failed relationships and stuff like that? I just want good fun time rock and roll music. And then there's like a more recent blues rock movement. And again, some of these bands are not really doing anything different than what came before. You got bands like Government Mule, right? A band from the South who aren't really sounding like, Lynyrd Skynyrd or Allman Brothers Band. Of course, you got Warren Haynes in this band. Definitely, a band that kind of patterned themselves after like Bad Company and Free and whatnot. You got Rival Sons, right? Total throwback to kind of those blues rock sounds. You got a guy who calls himself a blues guitar player, but yet he's definitely the poster child for modern day blues rock. You have Joe Bonamassa, right? Generally, a lot of this more newer stuff, and even the older stuff, lots of long guitar solos mixed with slower, long songs with lots of slower guitar solos, emotional vocals, again, lyrics about relationships and things, and some of them go the opposite direction, talking about drinking whiskey and going out to the bar on the weekends, party-themed topics and whatnot. But but just, again, I go back to what I said initially. Why is it called blues rock when rock music essentially came from the blues? That's what it's all about. So I again, anytime you add any little bluesy element, it's a blues rock element. I don't know. It's rock and roll to me, or just call it blues. I don't know. Whatever. Kind of silly.
Yeah. And we had the bluesy hair metals. We had that end of that, and then
Yes.
we just did a ranking of a blues rock band, Clutch, right?
Clutch, right? Exactly.
Blew
Winery
away.
Dogs, right? We mentioned Mr. Big before. We talked about Tesla. These are all bluesy rock bands, right? But yet,
yeah.
So I guess
right.
if you're a blues rock band, you have long hair and you use a little hairspray. You're no longer blues rock. Now you're hair metal, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Or hair blues rock, or whatever.
All right, my last one's kind of related to this. Actually goes in a few different places, but hard rock, right? So hard rock is like, it wasn't really, it was kind of thrown around. It was synonymous with heavy metal sort of at the time, like literally synonymous. But then as you move through time, it's like, okay, so was this a heavy metal band? Deep Purple in 1973. And then was this a hard rock band, or was this still a heavy metal band? Deep Purple at the end of the new wave of British heavy metal in 1984. It's actually heavier than this one. But is it, are they a hard rock band at that point? And then later on, when they're kind of almost still the same sort of band and just as heavy, do we call them a hard rock band, or do young people call them a hard rock band now? And do young people call them a hard rock band retroactively because so much heavy metal has come down the pikes? So I guess what I'm saying is originally you could have called them a heavy metal band. This was always the big problem band as well, AC/DC. Yeah. When we grew up, coming up, they were absolutely a heavy metal band, marked by, among other things, a pretty extreme vocal, right? Out of those guys. There's a reuse of a prop. So that was actually, believe it or not, a heavy metal band in the 70s. But then later on, absolutely no young pups would call them a heavy metal band. And then even hair metal has a problem where a lot of the hair metal bands, even a dirty hair metal band like this one, young kids have basically retroactively called the entire hair metal thing hard rock bands. So that happens. And they have basically called retroactively almost everything from the 70s hard rock bands. And part of this is because we had an up ratchet in various styles of heavy metal, beginning a little bit with the new wave of British heavy metal, certainly with thrash and death and black. So all of a sudden there was just by proxy, tens and hundreds of thousands of records that were 15 times heavier than all of this old stuff. So it's almost like the heavy metal term had to be thrown away, or just said it was that in the time. And now we've got this hard rock thing. And basically the other funny thing about this genre is that nobody gets called hard rock anymore. It's literally a term that is just parachuted in to describe various old styles of heavy metal.
Yeah, for sure. So in other words, if it's not heavy enough to be called heavy metal, it's probably kind of old sounding, and we'll call it blues rock.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, there's really, and as long as you both of us have been listening to heavier music, I mean, there's always that kind of fine line between what is hard rock and what is heavy metal. I always think of like a guy who sits right in the middle is a guy like Ted Nugent, right? He's not quite heavy enough to be called metal, but a lot of things about him are totally in line with metal, but yet he's generally now looked at as a hard rock guy, right? Where back in the day, we called him metal quite a bit, I think, early on. Yep. So, but yeah, it becomes heavy metal when it's more metallic. Like, what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
Like, what does that mean? More metallic. It's like, it's strange. That gap, that very thin gap between what is hard rock.
To put a fine line on it, more metallic kind of reminds me of Kill 'Em All and the birth of thrash. Like there's something more scrapey about it, right?
Yeah.
You can hear string scrape or concrete scrape when concrete has nothing to do with melodic. And you also kind of like, it seems more electric. And that's not exactly melodic either. I mean metallic. It's not right. And nothing to do with metal, right? So yeah, it's like in heavier metal, there's no more metal involved in the whole thing, right?
No.
Unless maybe Blackie's mic stand or something like that, right?
Right. So, I think of, like, to go even a little earlier, I think of the band that crosses over the line is like Judas Priest, right? You think of like heavy, that's heavy metal. And so, but why do we say that? Is the music more metallic sounding? Is it the leather and the chains and all that and the motorcycles? Perhaps, you know?
Yeah, you get people of a certain age who say Judas Priest was the first heavy metal band quite
Yeah,
often.
and yeah, and most of us don't really argue that. We try to say, well, it was really Sabbath, but I think when you think about all that we know, all the characteristics of heavy metal, Judas Priest is the band, right? Yeah. All right. So to further complicate this even more, so Martin just talked about hard rock, right? So there are characteristics of hard rock,
Yeah.
the powerful vocals and the lots of guitar, hard rock guitars, lots of riffs and solos and things like that. Maybe a bluesy nature, right? Whatever. Now there's this thing called AOR/melodic rock, AOR, adult oriented rock. Call it corporate rock, arena rock, melodic rock. We have five dogs in the house right now, so of course something's going on somewhere. Generally looked at as like a late 70s into the mid 80s thing, and it's this kind of music is tailor made for radio. So think of rock music and even hard rock music with big hooks, memorable choruses, bands like Journey and bands like Foreigner, even a Southern band like 38 Special, from the UK, Magnum, so kind of called pop rock. We won't go there. Jefferson Starship, Bad English, 80s Heart, for sure. We wouldn't have called Heart a AOR melodic rock band in the 70s. For Toto, for sure. Some Toto we call yacht rock as well. Who else? Geez, Loverboy, Billy Squire, Asia, Rick Springfield, The Babies, even some of the music of Styx, even Boston, Aldo
Night Ranger.
Night Ranger, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. And they kind of come on the end of this whole thing. Slick production values. Like I said, big guitars, big hooks, tailor made for catching people's ears on the radio, or we put together a video and we get them on MTV. Eventually, a lot of the hair bands that we talked about were also kind of lumped into this melodic rock thing. All right. It kind of went away in the beginning of the 90s, obviously from mainstream acceptance point of view. But it never really went away. There is this huge underground melodic rock scene, especially in Europe, not as much here anymore. It's like this was a huge thing in the States and in North America in the 80s into the early 90s. But man, over in Europe and Japan, this kind of music is still really, really big. You've got labels like Frontiers Records who are keeping the sound alive. And every week, it seems, there's a new melodic rock album coming out, whether it be like a super group project with guys who were from the scene in the 80s or the early 90s, or new bands that are coming up and creating music that's so similar to like Saga and Journey and Foreigner and all this other stuff. But my question is, isn't all rock melodic? Like, so in other words, if it's more radio friendly, it becomes melodic rock. And why call it AOR, adult oriented rock? Because it's only for adults. So if you're a teenager, you can't listen to this stuff. I don't know, but it's, to me, I just think it's, again, kind of ridiculous. But again, it's basically melodic rock. We weren't calling this stuff melodic rock back in the day. It's just rock music, right? Or hard rock music, whatever you want to call it. But now it's like, now all these years later, it's, to me, it's meant to signify music from a certain time period, the 80s, commercially acceptable, radio friendly, video friendly rock and roll, hence melodic rock. Whatever. I haven't created any of these, so I don't know, but I think it's pretty ridiculous. But again, it is a certain sound. They couldn't just call it 80s influence rock or throw the 80s in there somewhere, but I guess then they don't want to pigeonhole it on a certain time, because there were bands in the 70s doing this sort of thing as well. I think corporate rock is ridiculous. Arena rock is ridiculous. I don't know. It's,
yeah, you had Andrew with melodicrock.com putting out albums, putting on festivals. And then to add one more little thing to it, pomp rock, right? 707, Touch, Trillion, New England, American Tears.
Yeah. City Boy to an extent.
Yeah, all that stuff right there was sort of the birth of it as well. And AOR is a complicated one because it can go much mellower than what we're talking about here as well, right? So Yeah, wow, that's a lot. That's a lot of overlap between a lot of these. That's for sure.
Exactly. And so again, that poses the question: do we need all these subgenre tags when so much of this is very, very similar? But every little difference, got to give it a new name.
Yeah,
Got to give it a new name.
yeah, for sure.
I don't know, Martin. And the funny thing is, everybody watching, there's so many more that we didn't even touch upon today. That's how crazy it is. So, but I think we got some of the main.
But we had a bit of a tight theme here because these are all stupid. So
Yeah, they're all absolutely ridiculous. Yeah. If you have better names for them, if you're watching, you have better names for these little subgenres, put them down in the comments below. I'd be interesting to read what you have to say, because I could probably come up with dozens of different names for some of these that maybe make more sense. But again, nobody cares what I have to say. So it's like these unfortunately, these are going to stick. They've stuck for all these years. They're going to, I think, follow this music around forever. So whatever.
I wonder if we're going to get the comment, you know what? There's only good music and bad music.
And you know what? That's probably true, Martin. That is probably true. Yeah, and these subgenres, I've often seen people write stuff like, "Wow, these subgenres were created by journalists just so they can use them when they're describing music," and that may be the case. And there were many journalists who graced the scene way before Martin and I ever started doing this. So yeah, it's hey, I agree, but you got to call it something, right? And it's like when you're trying to explain, especially in written form, when you're trying to explain to someone what something sounds like, you have to use classifications and descriptions that people are familiar with. And so hence these things are created. But right, wrong, or indifferent, whatever, we didn't create them, so we're just here to talk about it. Anyway, Martin, give us an update on what's going on your end with the podcast and the Contrarians, and any books, new books in stock. Or
Yeah, so History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff podcast. The last one was on bad album titles. Contrarians were doing some of these build a bad album things. Boy, there's a theme going here, but I'm going to do 3 of those actually with Tim Derling today on Aerosmith. The different eras of Aerosmith. We're going to build a bad single album of those eras. And so yeah, it's Contrarians books, martinpopoff.com for any of the books that are in print at this point.
Cool. So let's see what's going on here. So tomorrow on the UK Connection, Simon, Stephen, and I will be ranking the songs on another classic album, and that album is Paranoid by Black Sabbath. So that is coming up tomorrow. Sunday on Ranking the Albums, Rick Labonte will be back on the show, and we will be ranking the albums of Big Elf, very cool band from the West Coast who kind of like bridge the gap between psychedelic rock, prog, and heavy rock. They haven't released an album in a while, but they have 4 studio albums and a couple of EPs. So we're going to be talking about Damon Fox. He's actually the brainchild of that band, really good singer and keyboard player, and he's actually now a member of the Cult. So I guess that's kind of why Big Elf has been on hold for a bit. So that's coming up on Sunday. I will be away on a business trip Monday through Wednesday next week, so we will not have Hudson Valley Squares or In the Prog Seat, but I'll be back Thursday for the Monsters Den, and of course back with Martin here next Friday. So till then, visit us on the web at www.seaoftranquility.org. We're on Facebook, we're on YouTube, all together, all the damn time. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and click on that notification bell so you get alert of all of our content as a post. And please do hit the like button before you leave if you like what you're seeing here on the channel. And have a good weekend, everybody. For Martin Popoff, I am Pete Pardo. We'll see you next Thursday on the Monsters Den. Take care.